Close your eyes and drift with me through time. The air cools, the world slows, and somewhere far away, a soft wind hums through the rafters of a mud-walled home. We're about to step into the long winter of the Middle Ages, a world without glass windows or humming heaters where survival itself was an art of courage. Yet even there, amid frost and smoke, people found warmth in one another, faith in the dark, and stories whispered by firelight. Tonight, we'll begin with the humblest of them all, the peasants who kept the first embers of human endurance alive. Night falls early in the medieval countryside. The last rays of sun melt into the horizon, and the fields stripped bare after harvest lie silent beneath a gathering frost. In a small hamlet at the edge of the woods, a handful of huts crouch low to the earth, as if they too are trying to keep warm. Smoke rises from their thatched roofs in thin, wavering threads. Inside one of them, a family of 5 gathers close around a hearth, no bigger than a cartwheel. The walls are made of wattle and daub sticks interlaced and coated with mud, mixed from straw and dung. They breathe with the wind. Every gust pushes a shiver through the house, lifting dust, teasing the thin rushes scattered on the dirt floor. There is no chimney, only a small hole in the roof that lets the smoke drift lazily upward, curling like ghosts, before vanishing into the dark. The air stings the eyes but feels alive, filled with the scent of wood ash and wool and the faint sweetness of hay. The father pokes at the fire with a stick, blackened at the tip. His hands are cracked, the skin so dry it looks carved from bark. The mother folds her shawl tighter and murmurs a prayer under her breath, one she repeats every night when the cold begins to bite. The children huddle together beneath a single rough blanket, their faces half-hidden, eyes shining in the dim glow. Beyond the wall, the family's cow shifts and exhales a warm, earthy breath. The sound is oddly comforting, the rhythm of a living creature sharing the same fragile shelter. Outside, the wind rises. It pushes through the holes around the door and rattles the shutters made from uneven planks. The house groans softly, a tired sigh. The father smiles faintly and says, "She'll hold through the night." He means the house, but also something larger, their will to endure another winter's evening. In places like this, optimism is spoken quietly, as if too loud a word might invite the storm to test it. The fire gives off just enough light to reveal the shapes of their possessions, a wooden bowl, a chipped mug, a wool cloak hanging by a peg. Everything smells faintly of smoke. The children whisper to each other about the warmth of summer, about green fields and buzzing bees. Their mother listens, smiling. Memory itself becomes a blanket, a reminder that not all seasons are cruel. As the night deepens, the fire dwindles. Shadows stretch long across the floor, and the small room feels even smaller. Yet in that shrinking space, something beautiful happens. The family draws closer until shoulders touch and their breaths mingle in the air like small clouds. They share what little they have. Body heat, soft laughter, a crust of bread saved from the day. It is not comfort in any grand sense, but it is enough. When the flames finally sink into glowing coals, the father gathers a handful of ash and carefully drapes it over the embers. It is an old trick taught by his father, and his father before him keep the embers buried. Keep them breathing slowly through the night. By morning, a single spark will remain ready to be fed again into life. He does it almost reverently, as though covering a sleeping child. The act itself feels sacred, the ritual of continuity. A silence settles over the hut. The wind outside softens to a low moan, like a creature tired of its own restlessness. Somewhere in the dark, a church bell rings faintly far away across the valley. The mother whispers a final prayer. Lord, keep the flame alive. The words drift upward, mingling with the smoke that slips through the hole in the roof, carried into the starlit cold. For a moment, the family sits awake, listening to the crackle beneath the ashes, the slow breathing of one another, the muted heartbeat of survival. In that soundless communion there is peace, fragile, smoky human. The kind of peace that doesn't come from abundance, but from the shared decision to believe in another dawn. If you could stand outside their hut and look upon the village from the hills, you'd see dozens of such lights glowing faintly in the dark, tiny pulses scattered across the land like embers on a great hearth. Each one holds a story, a family, a prayer whispered into the night. Together they form the first constellation of civilization's endurance proof that warmth is not found only in fire, but in hearts that refuse to go cold. And when the first snow begins to fall, covering the thatched roofs in white, those faint lights keep glowing. They are small, yes, but they are countless. They are the reason humanity made it through its longest winters. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed and hear the whisper of wind outside your window, remember them, the men and women who faced the dark with nothing but a spark, a prayer, and each other. Their story is our beginning. Before you drift away, if you found a little warmth in this tale, I invite you to join our growing circle of listeners. Subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, and together we'll keep these ancient lights burning one peaceful night at a time. The night passes quietly. Beneath layers of ash, the embers sleep, glowing faintly like tired stars beneath a veil of gray. Outside, frost paints the world in silence, white breath on every branch, frozen tears on every windowless wall. Yet inside the humble hut, life endures. When dawn finally stirs, the faint crackle from under the hearth whispers a single truth: the fire has survived. And in the medieval world, that small miracle means everything. In the heart of winter, survival isn't measured in days or meals, it's measured in flames. A single spark could mean the difference between life and death, between the promise of morning and the stillness that never ends. For the peasants of the Middle Ages, fire was not just warmth. It was breath, memory, and prayer, all woven into one fragile ember. Every evening, after the day's last light slipped behind the hills, families performed the same quiet ritual. The hearth was not left to burn out wildly. It was tamed, subdued, and finally buried. A thick blanket of ash was drawn gently over the coals to protect them from the cold air. The villagers called it banking the fire, though to them it was closer to tucking in a living soul for the night. Each family had its own way. Some pressed the ashes tight, others left them loose so the embers could breathe. No one wanted to wake to a cold hearth. Relighting a fire in winter was like starting life all over again, and few had the patience or dry kindling for that. When the mother rose before dawn, her breath visible in the icy air, she would kneel by the hearth and brush the ash aside with trembling fingers. If a tiny orange glow winked back at her from beneath the gray, she smiled. Still here she'd whisper, as though speaking to an old friend. Then with practiced care she'd feed it thin twigs, gently blowing until it caught and flared. The hut would fill once more with smoke warmth and the faint smell of yesterday's wood, a scent that meant life continued. Children learned early how precious that moment was. They would crowd close, their faces pink from the cold, watching the small flame rise like dawn, reborn in miniature. The father would grin, rubbing his hands near it, saying half seriously, "There, God still likes us." In a world where everything depended on the mercy of nature, even a flame felt like divine favor. Outside, the world offered no softness. The wind howled across empty fields, rattling bare branches. Water in the wooden pails froze solid. Yet the villagers carried on feeding animals, patching roofs, chopping what little wood they had left. They understood that winter demanded humility, not defiance. You could not conquer it. You could only endure it one ember at a time. In the evenings when the cold pressed hardest against the walls, the family gathered once again around the hearth. The glow from the fire cast long golden streaks across their faces, softening the lines of hardship. The father told stories of saints who brought warmth to the faithful, of angels who guarded the homes of the poor, of years when the frost never ended, and yet somehow people still lived. The children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations glowing as brightly as the fire itself. Sometimes neighbors came by, stamping snow from their boots, bringing a small loaf or a handful of dried herbs. They'd sit by the same fire, sharing stories and silence alike. In those moments, no one felt poor. Warmth shared was warmth multiplied. The flames flickered on the walls, reflecting in tired eyes that carried centuries of endurance. When the conversation turned quiet, the only sounds were the pop of resin in the logs and the gentle breathing of those dozing near the warmth. The mother would look into the fire and think of the years ahead of planting and harvest of her children growing tall. The fire reminded her that even the hardest seasons passed, and spring would come again, soft as a promise. The villagers had no calendars, but they counted winters by the scars on their hands, by the depth of snow, by how often they'd had to mend the thatch. Every winter felt eternal while it lasted. Yet each ember that survived to morning carried the memory of all the winters before it, the proof that they had endured and would again. As night settled once more, the father leaned near the hearth, scooping ash over the glowing coals. The motion was slow, deliberate. Outside, the wind moaned low through the trees, but inside there was calm. The family knew that beneath that pale cover of ash, the heart of their home would keep beating softly unseen. There was poetry in that act. To keep the fire alive was to keep faith alive. It said, "We will rise again. We will rebuild. We will love even in the cold." Each ember was a testament to humanity's quiet defiance, a defiance not shouted in battle, but whispered in warmth. And when the mother finally lay down beside her children, she could feel the faint heat through the floor. It was like sleeping above a heartbeat, steady and slow. The little ones murmured drowsy prayers, thanking God for the warmth, for the bread, for the roof that hadn't yet fallen. The night pressed close against the hut, but the family's breath and the buried fire pushed it gently away. If you stood outside, snow swirling around your cloak, and listened carefully, you might hear the faint crackle of hidden life within. A single ember glowing under ash, unseen, but undefeated, like hope itself. And that perhaps is what kept the medieval world alive through centuries of frost and hunger, the understanding that even the smallest flame is worth protecting. That life, no matter how fragile, burns brighter when shared. So tonight, as you lie beneath your blankets and feel the warmth around you, remember those who guarded their fires so carefully, who passed down the simple art of keeping hope alive. Let their quiet courage fill you with peace. And if this story has kindled something gentle in your heart, I invite you to join our circle of warmth. Subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, where every tale is a spark waiting to glow beside you through the night, reminding you that even in the coldest season, light never truly dies. The embers glow softly beneath their veil of ash, just as they have through countless nights. One family's quiet triumph becomes another's hope. And across the frozen countryside, small hearths flicker like distant stars. Yet even the bravest flame cannot stand alone forever. In the villages of the Middle Ages, warmth was not simply found in fire. It lived in the people themselves. When the cold grew deeper than bone, when the wind howled like wolves beyond the door, they turned not inward, but toward one another. That was how they survived. In the depths of winter, a village became a single body, a cluster of hearts beating in unison against the endless dark. It was not just a collection of huts or families. It was a living network of breath, labor, and prayer. Each home, each ember was a pulse of the same fragile life. When one fire threatened to die, others rose to share their light. On the coldest nights, no one truly slept. Sleep was a luxury for warmer seasons, for fields in bloom, and nights scented with rain. In winter, people slept in turns, waking to tend the fire, to stir the ashes, to check on animals that shared their roofs. It was an unspoken rhythm, half of the family resting, while the other half watched over the flame. Even the smallest children learned that survival was not a private act. It was a task shared among many. When the wind screamed outside the village, stayed awake together. One could see the faint glimmers of light glowing from hut to hut, tiny halos trembling in the night air. Sometimes neighbors shouted greetings through the dark, just to remind one another they were still there. A single human voice cutting through the blizzard could warm the spirit better than any fire. There was comfort in the closeness. Families often gathered in one home to conserve warmth. The men brought in bundles of wood, the women prepared thin soups that smelled faintly of onions and herbs, and the elders told stories to keep the mind from freezing in silence. They spoke of saints who tamed the cold, of miracles born in the bleakest hours of years, when snow covered the earth so thick that only church steeples rose above it. These tales were not told to entertain, but to remind everyone that endurance had always been the way of their people. Children listened, eyes wide, imagining angels wrapped in cloaks of light wandering through the storm. Sometimes they fell asleep mid-story, heads resting on their mothers' laps, while the elders kept talking softly, their voices blending with the crackle of the fire. Words became warmth. When a roof caved under snow, it was never just that family's disaster. The men gathered before sunrise, shoveling with bare hands, patching with straw and wooden planks, working until their fingers bled. The women brought broth and bread, moving between houses like quiet spirits. No one was left alone because loneliness itself could kill faster than frost. The village's strength was not in its walls, but in its shared heartbeat. In those long frozen months, even the animals became part of the circle of survival. The cow's body heat warmed the room, and the rhythmic breathing of the sheep was like a lullaby. Chickens huddled in baskets, their feathers puffed like tiny pillows. The sounds, grunts, clucks, sighs created a strange harmony, a kind of living music that filled the silence. For the peasants, this was the orchestra of winter, not grand but real, reminding them that life still moved, still persisted. When food grew scarce, they shared that too. One household might have flour, another beans, another a few apples saved in straw. There were no written rules, no ledgers or debts, only the understanding that generosity today meant survival tomorrow. It was this instinct, older than any kingdom or church, that bound them together. Sometimes, when the sky cleared after a storm, the villagers would step outside and look up. The stars shimmered with a fierce clarity, as if the heavens themselves had frozen. The air bit their faces, but it also filled their lungs with a strange purity. Under that vast, cold dome, they felt small, yet not insignificant. Each soul, each flicker of light from the cottages below, seemed part of something larger, a constellation drawn from courage and compassion. There were moments of quiet joy, too. On rare days when the sun broke through the clouds, children ran outside, their laughter sharp and bright against the snow. They chased shadows, rolled icy balls, and came back inside with red cheeks and wide grins. Even in hardship, laughter had a way of thawing the edges of fear. As night returned, the families gathered again. The church bell in the distance tolled softly, perhaps, calling for evening prayer, or perhaps just marking time in a world where days and nights blurred together. People bowed their heads. Their prayers were simple gratitude for the warmth, for the food, for the neighbor who had helped mend the roof. The cold did not make them bitter. It made them humble, aware of every breath and every kindness. And so the nights passed, one after another, measured not by calendars, but by the rhythm of care, the lifting of a pot, the passing of bread, the stirring of embers. The village endured as one great breathing body, bound by trust and necessity, by love that spoke little but acted much. When dawn finally came after one especially harsh night, the sky blushed pink over the fields. A thin mist rose from the snow, shimmering like breath. The villagers stepped outside, blinking against the pale light, and looked toward each other's homes. Every chimney still smoked. Every family had made it through. The relief was quiet, reverent. Someone began to hum a hymn, low and sweet, and others joined in until the whole village seemed to sing softly into the new day. They had done it again together. The cold had tested them, but unity had answered. And as they returned indoors, they carried that unspoken warmth with them, a warmth made not of wood or fire, but of human hands reaching out through the dark. In that ancient world, no one could afford isolation. Their lives were proof that community was not a comfort, it was survival. And perhaps that truth carried quietly through the centuries is why even today we find peace and togetherness in shared meals, in shared silence, in the company of others who keep our spirits from freezing. So as you drift toward sleep, let your mind rest among them. The villagers awake beneath the same stars, the faint fires glowing, the voices calling softly across the snow. Feel the calm of their unity, the steady warmth of their shared faith, and know that somewhere within you too, that same ember of connection still burns gentle, eternal, and enough to light another night. The long winter night softened at last, fading like the final verse of a hymn. The village had endured again, its lights still glowing, its people still breathing their faith unbroken. Smoke rose from every chimney, a sign that life had outlasted the cold. Yet, for the peasants of the Middle Ages, survival was never only a battle of flesh against frost. It was also a battle of the soul, a quiet struggle to keep faith alive when the world outside seemed frozen in silence. And so, beneath the thatched roofs and starlit skies, they turned to prayer. Before the first light touched the frost, the bell from the village chapel rang, once its tone thin but resolute, echoing through the still air. The sound drifted over snow-covered fields, past sleeping animals, over rooftops glazed with ice. It was a call not to work, but to wake to give thanks for another day granted by mercy. Inside each hut, people stirred slowly, their breath white in the cold air. The fires banked through the night were coaxed back to life with trembling hands. The flames rose timidly, as if uncertain they were welcome after so much darkness. Soon the familiar scent of smoke and bread filled the air, mingling with the faint perfume of burning pine. It was a humble breakfast for the body, but for the soul, there was something greater awaiting the morning prayer. They prayed before they spoke. It was the rhythm of life itself. A mother whispered her gratitude over the cradle of her sleeping child. A father, stepping into the bitter dawn, traced the sign of the cross on his chest before lifting his axe to chop wood. The old bent their knees slowly before the hearth, muttering words half remembered from Latin psalms. Even the youngest, though they did not yet understand the meaning, repeated the phrases by sound, their small voices weaving into the great unbroken hymn of survival. The church at the heart of the village was small, a single room built of stone and hope, with walls cracked by time and roof patched with straw. Yet to those who entered it felt vast. The air was colder inside than out, but the silence was sacred, thick with centuries of whispered pleas. Wooden pews creaked under the weight of cloaked figures. Candles flickered weakly along the altar, their light dancing against the faces of saints carved by unknown hands. The priest, weary and pale, lifted his eyes to the worn crucifix that hung above him. He knew every soul before him by name, knew their struggles, their hunger, their quiet acts of kindness. His Latin words trembled with sincerity more than authority. He did not speak as a man above them, but as one among them, another pilgrim walking through the cold. His prayer was not eloquent, but it was real that the Lord would spare the crops, Protect the animals, heal the sick, and keep the fire burning in every heart. Outside snow began to fall again softly, silently, like a benediction. It dusted the straw roofs and turned the narrow paths between homes into pale ribbons of light. The villagers returned to their work shoulders bent beneath woolen cloaks, their minds still echoing the morning's prayer. They did not think of faith as something separate from life. It was woven into every motion. Every swing of the axe, every loaf baked, every door closed against the wind was an act of belief. At night, the prayers continued. The same families who gathered around the hearth to share soup and stories now knelt together on the earthen floor. The fire's glow became their candlelight, and their shadows flickered like saints upon the wall. The words they spoke were simple: protect us, forgive us, keep us warm. But behind those words lay a vast unspoken truth, that even in their poverty they understood gratitude. Each breath was a gift, each heartbeat a miracle. The children sometimes asked why they prayed when the winters never seemed to change, when hunger and sickness returned year after year. The elders smiled gently and said, "Because prayer keeps the soul from freezing. They did not pray to change the world. They prayed to remain kind within it." One night, when the storm was at its worst, the wind tore part of the thatch from a villager's roof. Snow poured in, and the family huddled together, terrified. But within moments, neighbors appeared, men with hammers, women carrying spare straw, a priest with his lantern held high. Together they worked through the night, patching the roof, singing hymns to keep their courage alive. And when dawn came, the house stood firm again, golden light spilling through the cracks. The family wept not from fear, but from awe. To them that rescue was prayer answered. Faith was not a luxury in those times. It was the thread holding every life together. It lived in the rhythm of the bell, in the smoke that rose heavenward, in the kindness passed from one cold hand to another. And when someone died, as happened often in those brutal winters, the villagers did not curse the heavens. They walked slowly to the small graveyard beside the chapel, singing softly, believing that even in death, warmth awaited somewhere beyond. When spring finally came, the first thaw revealed what the snow had hidden. Beneath the white blanket lay seeds that had endured all along, sleeping under frost, waiting for sunlight. The peasants saw this and understood. They had been like those seeds buried in hardship, preserved by faith. Their prayers, whispered through the dark months, were answered not with riches or ease, but with renewal. By the time the fields turned green again, the church bell sounded different. It no longer mourned, it rejoiced. Children ran barefoot through the mud, mothers laughed as they hung clothes in the wind, and fathers looked to the sky, their eyes bright with the reflection of clouds instead of snow. Yet even in joy, the habit of prayer remained. Gratitude had become their second nature. At night, when stars replaced the sun, the villagers still gathered beneath their straw roofs to whisper the old words. Their voices were softer now, filled with peace instead of pleading. The fires burned brighter, the air smelled of wet earth and promise. And as the wind moved gently over the rooftops, carrying those prayers toward the heavens, one could almost believe the whole world exhaled together in relief. It was faith that kept them human through the cold, faith that made them humble in the light. And though centuries have passed, perhaps that faith still lingers in us, a quiet strength, a soft voice reminding us that no winter lasts forever, and no darkness can silence a heart that prays. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the glow of those ancient fires, the sound of bells over distant fields, the whisper of 1,000 voices rising from straw-roofed homes. Let their faith warm you gentle and deep like a lullaby across time. Rest now, knowing that even in the longest nights, someone long ago already prayed for your dawn. The bells that once echoed over snow-covered fields grew quieter with the passing years, fading into the distance of time. The prayers of peasants rose and vanished like smoke, yet something of their endurance remained carried forward in the blood and spirit of generations. Humanity had learned to survive the cold, to build, to hope, to believe. And with that endurance came a new hunger, not just to live, but to shape destiny itself. The age of faith and frost gave way to an age of ambition and brilliance. And from the quiet fields of England, a young woman named Anne Boleyn stepped into history's light. She was not born among crowns or courtiers. Anne Boleyn entered the world around the turn of the 16th century, a daughter of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, names of polite standing but not yet the language of legend. Her childhood was marked by curiosity more than privilege, by the restless awareness that she was meant for more than the narrow lanes of her homeland. From her earliest years, Anne's mind was alive, bright, quick, restless as a bird. Her father, a shrewd diplomat, recognized the rare light in her eyes and sent her abroad hoping to polish what England might not yet understand. And so Anne crossed the Channel, leaving behind the green hills of Kent for the glittering courts of Europe, where every smile carried meaning and every word could shift the tides of power. In the court of Margaret of Austria, Anne learned not only languages, but the subtler arts grace, poise, wit. She discovered how to speak with her eyes before her mouth, how to listen for what was not said, how to move through rooms like music softly, but leaving memory in her wake. The days were filled with laughter, and learning the nights with songs and candlelight that flickered on silk and silver. When she later traveled to France, serving Queen Claude and then the radiant Queen Marguerite of Navarre, Anne found herself in a world even more refined. The air smelled of roses and ink. Philosophers and poets debated beneath painted ceilings. Women were not merely ornaments here. They were voices, minds, muses. Anne absorbed everything, their wit, their style, their courage to speak. She carried herself with a new elegance, neither shy nor bold, but luminous. In those years abroad, Anne became something rare. A woman educated not only in etiquette, but in thought. She learned theology and music dance and diplomacy. She understood how power could hide behind charm, and how charm could become power. France gave her more than refinement. It gave her confidence in the quiet conviction that she was not born to fade into the background. When she returned to England in the early 1520s, the court she entered was a far duller scene than the one she had left. The halls of King Henry VIII were filled with courtiers who laughed too loudly and flattered too easily. Yet among them Anne stood apart. Her dark hair, her quick smile, her sharp eyes, they drew attention like a spark in shadow. She was not a conventional beauty, and that was her greatest strength. Men were intrigued, women wary. There was something magnetic in her composure, a certainty that did not belong to the usual daughters of England. Anne's return did not go unnoticed. Whispers began to circle like moths around her candlelight. She had the manners of a Frenchwoman, they said, and the intelligence of a scholar. Some found her fascinating, others found her dangerous. Even the Queen Catherine of Aragon noticed the young woman's growing popularity. But Anne was careful. She danced when it was polite to dance, laughed when it was safe to laugh, and always stayed just beyond the reach of gossip's blade. In those early years back in England, she was not yet the scandal that history would remember. She was simply a woman who refused to shrink. She spent her days among tapestries and harp's embroidery hoops and courtly banquets, learning the delicate rhythm of royal life. Yet beneath that calm surface ambition stirred a silent flame she fed with every encounter, every compliment, every glance. People said she had brought something back from France besides grace, a way of thinking, a subtle defiance, the conviction that a woman could hold her own in a world ruled by men, not by loud rebellion, but by the precise art of presence. Wherever Anne went, rooms seemed brighter, conversations sharper, and eyes followed her without knowing why. But it wasn't vanity that guided her, it was vision. She had seen what women could be in the courts of Europe, advisors, confidants, even architects of ideas. She had watched queens who ruled not by decree, but by persuasion. And she carried within her the quiet hope that perhaps in her own way, she too might shape the world around her. The courtiers could not decide what to make of her. Some called her enchanting, others improper. They said she laughed too freely, spoke too boldly, moved too gracefully for someone of her birth. But Anne did not mind. She had learned that discomfort was the first sign of change. Each night she wrote letters to her father describing the life at court, the festivals, the politics, the subtle rivalries hidden behind smiles. Her words glowed with intelligence and humor, but also something deeper. The sense that she was waiting for something, though she could not yet name it. A door stood before her, invisible but inevitable. And somewhere beyond it, destiny waited with patient hands. Sometimes in her quieter moments, Anne would sit by her window and look out over the gardens. The English air was colder than France's, the skies more somber. But there was beauty even in the gray. She thought of the peasant women who prayed under that same sky, who lit candles in small stone chapels just as her ancestors once had. Perhaps she mused the same God who heard their whispered hopes, also listened to her silent ones. And maybe that was why, despite all her learning, all her charm and wit, Anne never quite lost her reverence for things unseen. Beneath the silk and laughter, there was still the same quiet girl from Hever Castle, the child who had once looked at the world and believed she could change it. She didn't yet know how fate would test her faith, nor how high it would lift her before letting her fall. For now she was still the flower in bloom, the one England had not yet noticed was about to reshape its garden forever. As night gathered over the Tudor court torches, flickering against the stone walls, Anne Boleyn looked out at the horizon. The moonlight touched her face like a promise. She could not see the storm ahead, but perhaps even then she felt the wind beginning to change. And so begins the next chapter of our story, not of peasants in the cold, but of a woman whose fire would burn in the heart of kings. Her story, too, would test what it means to endure. For though the frost had melted another kind of winter, waited one born not of weather, but of desire, power, and faith. The flower that had returned from France was no longer the quiet girl her family once knew. Anne Boleyn had stepped into the English court like a gust of foreign air, bright, intoxicating, and impossible to ignore. The courtiers whispered, and even the queen noticed her, though it was not yet with suspicion. But someone else saw her too, someone whose gaze could change the course of kingdoms. He was the King of England. Henry VIII, powerful and restless, a man who believed that God himself smiled upon his every desire. And in Anne, that desire would find both its muse and its ruin. The court of Henry VIII was a world of glitter and danger, a place where laughter could mask betrayal, and a careless glance could alter fate. Beneath the painted ceilings and heavy tapestries, ambition hung in the air, as thick as the perfume of roses. Every smile was a strategy, every compliment a small act of war. And into this world stepped Anne Boleyn, graceful as a shadow, carrying with her a confidence that set her apart from every woman who had come before her. At first, she was merely another lady in the Queen's household, a sharp mind among softer voices, a spark among embers. But even in her quiet moments, Anne radiated something the court had never seen before. When she walked across the great hall, heads turned not out of obligation but curiosity. She had an elegance born not of wealth, but of understanding, an instinct for rhythm, for presence, for the power of being seen without seeming to ask for it. It was during one of the court's many evening revels that Henry first noticed her. The king, large and proud in his jeweled doublet, had grown weary of the familiar smiles that greeted him wherever he turned. He was a man used to admiration to submission, but when his gaze fell upon Anne, he found neither. She curtsied, yes, but her eyes met his for an instant longer than custom allowed, a flicker of intelligence that unsettled and intrigued him. It was not defiance. It was invitation wrapped in restraint. Henry asked her name. She answered with a soft smile and a voice like clear water. Thomas Boleyn's daughter, he was told, a good family, clever connections, a French-educated wit. The king nodded, pretending casual interest, but his curiosity had already begun to smolder. Days passed, then weeks. He found reasons to linger near her during hunts at banquets in the gardens where the ladies of the court gathered like bright birds. Anne spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. She teased him once lightly, playfully, about a badly aimed arrow during a hunt, and he laughed louder than he had in years. The court noticed. The Queen noticed. It was not the first time Henry's attention had wandered. He was known for his appetite for music, for power, for beauty. But Anne was different. She did not yield. When he sent her small gifts, a brooch shaped like a heart, a ribbon the color of wine, she returned them politely, saying she could not accept such favors from her sovereign. When he praised her, she thanked him without flattery. Her refusals were her strength. They turned admiration into pursuit. The king who had conquered nations found himself disarmed by a woman who would not bend. And so began a dance, one measured not by music, but by glances, silences, and the tremor of possibility, that passed through the air whenever they were near each other. At court, gossip blossomed like spring weeds. The ladies whispered behind their fans. The men traded wagers in low voices. Some pitied the queen, gentle Catherine of Aragon, whose devotion to her husband had weathered decades of trials. Others watched Anne with envy or fear. They saw in her the same thing Henry did, an intelligence that refused to hide behind obedience. Anne herself walked carefully through that garden of whispers. She knew the danger of being noticed by a king, and she understood that power offered too easily was power already lost. So she smiled when she must withdrew when she could, and let his longing grow like a flame starved of air. In the quiet of her chambers, she sometimes prayed. Not for love, perhaps she had seen too much of men's hearts to believe in love's purity, but for wisdom, for clarity, to know what she was being drawn toward. She had tasted the luxury of court life, the thrill of being desired by a king, but she also knew that every royal favor came wrapped in peril. Yet something inside her whispered that this was not chance. It was destiny. Henry's letters began soon after. Pages filled with longing declarations of suffering and passion, written in the ornate script of a man unused to waiting. "My heart and I surrender to you," he wrote, "though you refuse me mercy." Anne read them by candlelight, the wax dripping like tears, and folded them carefully away. Each word bound them closer, even as she kept him at arm's length. What she wanted, perhaps even she did not fully know. Power, respect. The chance to shape her world instead of merely surviving within it. Or perhaps she wanted to believe that she could be loved, not as a possession, but as an equal. Whatever the truth, the line between ambition and longing blurred until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. As months turned into years, Henry's infatuation became obsession. His marriage to Catherine, once a source of pride, began to feel like a prison. The queen could give him devotion, but not the son he so desperately wanted. And in Anne he saw not only beauty, but promise, newness, fertility, the future itself. The king, who had once been the church's defender, now began to question the church's authority. All for her. Anne, too, changed in those years. The young woman who once danced in candlelight now moved with the awareness that history had taken notice of her. Her gowns grew darker, her gaze steadier, her laughter rarer. She stood on the edge of something vast, something she could not yet name. She was still the flower from France, but now her petals glimmered with frost. When she stood before the mirror at night, she sometimes wondered who she had become. The reflection stared back beautiful, clever, and slightly haunted. She touched the silver cross at her neck and whispered a prayer, not for glory, but for strength. For she could feel it, the world was shifting, and she was its axis. Outside, the bells of Westminster rang through the mist. The court was still holding its breath. Somewhere the king paced his chambers restless, and certain that his heart's desire was worth any cost. And in another room, Anne Boleyn closed her eyes, the faintest smile on her lips, half hope, half warning. For the first time in her life, She had caught the gaze of a man who could change the world, and neither of them yet knew how dearly the world would pay for that single glance. The king's gaze had become her shadow. Letters turned into vows, and whispers became commands. Anne Boleyn, once the cautious lady-in-waiting, now stood at the center of a storm that neither she nor Henry could contain. The world around them began to tremble. Courtiers divided priests, whispered of sin, and the queen prayed with tear-streaked hands. The pursuit that began as desire was becoming destiny, and as Henry's passion deepened, so too did the darkness gathering behind it. The air in the court had changed. It no longer smelled of roses and music, but of tension and incense of secrets carried between stone walls. The courtiers spoke in low tones, glancing over their shoulders, before daring to utter her name. The king's lady they called her, though not always kindly. To some she was enchantment itself, grace and intelligence, woven into flesh. To others she was the serpent in paradise. Anne Boleyn walked through that court like someone balancing between heaven and ruin. The pearls at her throat gleamed softly, but she wore them as though they weighed upon her. Every step she took echoed in the corridors of power. Each gesture watched, each word remembered. She had won the king's heart, yes, but in doing so she had set in motion the unthinkable, a war not of armies but of faith. Henry could not bear distance any longer. He spoke openly now, calling Anne my dearest, my only. He told his advisers that his marriage to Queen Catherine had never been valid, that God was punishing England with a barren womb. His confessor warned him of heresy, but Henry brushed it aside. God speaks through my conscience, he declared. Yet in truth it was not conscience, it was love, or something perilously close to it. The queen, gentle and devout, retreated into prayer. She had served her king since girlhood, had shared his victories and losses, had buried their children together. Now she watched in silence as he turned his eyes toward another. She never cursed Anne, only wept quietly before the crucifix, whispering that God's justice moved slower than man's desire, but more surely. Anne tried not to meet the queen's gaze when they crossed paths in the chapel. There was too much pain there, too much humanity. But Anne was no longer free to turn back. The king's promise had become her fate. He vowed to make her his wife, to crown her as the rightful Queen of England. The words sounded like salvation, but they rang with prophecy. Years of struggle followed, letters to Rome, debates with bishops, sleepless nights filled with anger and doubt. The Pope refused the annulment. The Emperor Catherine's nephew threatened war. The court trembled under the weight of scandal. And through it all, Anne waited. She waited while Henry argued with his conscience, while kingdoms teetered, while priests and advisors lost their heads literally and otherwise. She had not asked for this chaos, but she had become its heart. When the courtiers blamed her, she held her chin high. When Henry grew weary of the church's refusal, she whispered courage into his ear. "If Rome will not bless us," she said then, "let England bless itself." Her words were like flint to his pride. And so it happened. Henry broke from Rome. The bells of England rang not for unity, but division. Monks were silenced altars, stripped ancient prayers, replaced with new ones. And at the center of it all stood Anne Boleyn, her dark eyes gleaming like stormlight. To some, she was Jezebel reborn. To others, she was the dawn of a new world. In January of 1533, in the secrecy of winter, Anne became Henry's wife. She was 6 months with child. The ceremony was quiet, almost furtive, yet the air shimmered with the enormity of it. Two people stood before God, believing they had rewritten destiny. When she looked into Henry's eyes, she saw not the king, but the man who had once written her letters, filled with trembling love. She believed in him still, even as the world turned against her. That June, she was crowned Queen of England. The streets filled with the sound of trumpets and shouts. Crowds gathered to see the woman who had dared to defy both Pope and tradition. Her gown was heavy with gold thread. Her crown glittered like fire. She smiled, but beneath the jewels her heart beat unevenly. She saw in the people's eyes not only wonder, but warning. Their cheers carried the chill of judgment. In the months that followed, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The king had hoped for a son, an heir to secure his new dynasty. But when Anne held the small, red-faced infant in her arms, she felt only joy. "A daughter, yes," she whispered, "but one who will rule like a lion." Henry smiled faintly, but the disappointment lingered like a shadow on his face. The court celebrated, though the celebration was uneasy. The men who once praised her now whispered of her temper, her pride, her sharp tongue. "She forgets. She is mortal," they said. The women envied her gowns, but pitied her heart. Even her friends began to withdraw, frightened by the king's growing moodiness. Anne, sensing the shifting tides, began to pray again, not as she once had, in hope, but in fear. Sometimes she walked alone in the palace gardens, where roses bloomed red against gray stone. She would kneel there, hands clasped, and ask God to forgive her for what she could not always say. Perhaps for taking another woman's place, perhaps for the storm she had unleashed. But she also prayed for strength, for the courage to be more than the whisper of a scandal, for the wisdom to protect her child from the claws of history. Henry's love had once been the sun that lit her world. Now it was a flame that burned too close. His temper, once charming, began to harden. When she spoke her mind, he frowned. When she laughed too freely, he grew cold. The courtiers saw it, and their smiles sharpened. The same tongues that had praised her beauty now foretold her fall, and still Anne refused to break. "I have faced colder winds," she told her ladies, "and I have survived." She wore her crown as armor, though its weight grew heavier each day. But even she could feel it, the ground beneath her shifting, the court's loyalty turning like a tide. Somewhere beyond her reach, a new name was being whispered: Jane Seymour. A gentler woman, a quieter shadow. History's next chapter already waiting. And as the days shortened and the king's eyes wandered elsewhere, Anne began to understand that the fire which had lifted her to glory was the same one that would consume her. Yet even then, as winter approached again, she held her head high. "If I must fall," she murmured one evening, looking toward the gray sky, "let it be knowing that I once stood where no woman ever dared." In that moment, The wind caught her words and carried them across the palace rooftops, where they mingled with the prayers of those who still loved her and the fears of those who wished her gone. The crown glittered in the fading light, a circle of gold, a halo, a curse, and beneath its weight, Anne Boleyn remained what she had always been, a woman unafraid to burn for the life she believed she could create. The crown glittered upon her head, but it was no longer light. It pressed against her temples like an invisible hand, heavy with the silence of those who once praised her. Around Anne Boleyn, the court had grown colder. The laughter that once followed her now stopped when she entered a room. The same eyes that had admired her beauty now searched for cracks in her grace. And the king, her king, no longer looked at her with fire, but with fatigue. The woman who had changed a kingdom was about to face her greatest trial, not the wrath of her enemies, but the abandonment of love itself. Dawn crept softly into the queen's chambers, spilling pale gold over the embroidered curtains. Anne lay awake long before the light touched her face. The palace was quiet, save for the cawing of distant crows and the steady tick of the clock. She turned her head toward the cradle beside her bed, where her daughter slept, the small, perfect form of Elizabeth, wrapped in white linen. The child's breath rose and fell in the rhythm of innocence, untouched by the weight that had begun to settle over her mother's heart. Anne reached out, brushing a strand of fine red gold hair from the child's cheek. "You are my morning," she whispered. "Whatever they say, whatever they do, remember that you were born of love." Her voice trembled, but the words were steady. She knew the court would not love Elizabeth as she did. The king still longed for a son. The courtiers whispered that the child was a disappointment. Yet to Anne, Elizabeth was proof that God had not forgotten her, that hope could still take shape in fragile hands. She rose quietly and crossed to the window. Outside, the palace gardens glistened with dew. The roses she had planted in her first spring as queen were wilting now, their petals scattered across the path like pieces of a forgotten crown. The sight filled her with an ache she could not name. Once she had walked those gardens with Henry, laughing as the wind tangled her hair. Now she walked alone. The king's visits had grown fewer. He came sometimes out of duty, sometimes out of habit, but rarely out of affection. His eyes drifted when she spoke, his words curt, his smile hollow. There were whispers of another woman, a lady in waiting named Jane Seymour, whose gentleness stood in stark contrast to Anne's sharp wit. Anne had seen her once pale and quiet, with eyes that never lifted too high. She was everything Anne was not, and that made her dangerous. Still, Anne refused to yield to despair. She had faced worse storms. She attended court, hosted banquets, wore her jewels, and held her head high. But each gesture of dignity cost her something unseen. Her laughter sounded forced. Her hands trembled when she lifted her cup. She was surrounded by courtiers who bowed deeply, yet longed for her fall. She knew it. They all knew it. The walls had begun to listen. One evening, as the firelight flickered in her private chapel, Anne knelt to pray. She clasped her hands tightly, her lips moving without sound. "Lord," she whispered at last, "you gave me this crown. You gave me this child.
If it is your will to take them, let me not curse your name. Only grant me strength to face what comes. The candle before her trembled in the draught as if bowing in answer. The next day, news reached her that chilled her blood. Her brother George had been accused of speaking treasonously, of mocking the king's new marriage. It was nonsense, of course, yet she knew how quickly nonsense became truth in the corridors of power. Every whisper now carried danger. Every ally might turn into a witness. Still, Anne faced the court with poise. She smiled when she must dined, when commanded prayed, when watched. But inside, she began to sense that history was already writing its next chapter, and her name was inked in sorrow. She had fought the church and the world for Henry's love, and now that love was dying before her eyes. It was not hatred that replaced it, but something colder indifference. When the king spoke to her of faith, it was no longer in shared belief, but in accusation. When she mentioned Elizabeth, his expression hardened. "We will have sons yet," he said, as though dismissing the daughter who bore his features. Anne bit her tongue, her pride like a wound that refused to close. That night she held Elizabeth close against her chest, rocking gently as the wind rattled the shutters. "You must be strong," she whispered. "Stronger than I? Stronger than your father? Promise me, my little one, you will never bow to fear." The baby stirred her tiny hand, grasping Anne's finger as if sealing a vow across time. The following weeks passed like pages in a book that no longer belonged to her. Jane Seymour's name grew louder in the corridors. The king's affection for Anne became a matter of mockery whispered in the shadows. Men who once fought to serve her now avoided her gaze. Yet she refused to fade. She appeared at Mass, radiant, her gown the color of sunrise. She spoke with clarity, her words laced with grace and steel. A queen must be seen, she told her ladies. Even when she is forgotten, they admired her courage, but feared her resolve. Some whispered that she had become proud. Others that she had gone mad. Neither was true. Anne simply understood that dignity was the last defense of the condemned. In moments of solitude, she thought of the young girl who once studied music and poetry in France, who laughed under candlelight and dreamed of changing the world. That girl had not vanished. She had merely grown quiet. Perhaps Anne thought God allows dreams to die so that faith might live. Then one morning, as spring returned to England, she awoke to a silence heavier than usual. No servants greeted her. No messengers came. When she opened her door, 2 guards stood waiting. "Your Grace," one said softly, eyes lowered. "The king requests your presence at the tower." Her pulse did not quicken. Her first thought was not fear, but clarity. It had come at last. The storm she had long sensed had arrived. She turned, glanced once more at Elizabeth's cradle, and whispered, "Sleep well, my love. Your mother will watch over you from the dawn." She followed the guards without protest. The corridors she had once ruled now stretched before her like a long farewell. Sunlight poured through the stained glass painting, her in colors of blood and gold. She lifted her head high every step, a prayer, every breath a surrender. The tower gates opened. She entered not as a queen betrayed, but as a woman finally freed from pretense. The morning sky was bright above her, the same sky under which she had once been crowned. And as she walked into her fate, the world around her seemed to pause, not in mockery, not in pity, but in silence, as though even the wind held its breath for the woman who had dared to love a king.
The tower swallowed her, and history closed its heavy door. Anne Boleyn's life ended where her courage refused to bend. Yet her story did not die there. From her bloodline, a daughter would rise, Elizabeth, whose quiet strength would one day steady a trembling kingdom. And beyond England's shores, the same restless spirit of freedom and faith that once burned in Anne would cross oceans, carried in the hearts of those who sought a new beginning. Far from the palaces of Europe, across the gray Atlantic waters, a different fire began to glow. A fire not of crowns, but of liberty. The year was 1773, and Boston slept beneath a sky of frozen stars. The harbor was still the ships anchored in silence, their masts reaching like black spires into the night. The air smelled of salt and smoke, of iron and damp wood. And beneath that calm surface, something was stirring, something that would soon shake the world awake. In the narrow streets where lanterns flickered against the frost, men moved quietly from door to door. Their cloaks were drawn tight, their breath pale ghosts in the cold. They carried no torches, no banners, only whispers and resolve. These were merchants, farmers, printers, and blacksmiths, ordinary men who had grown tired of kneeling. Inside a modest tavern near Griffin's Wharf, the meeting was already underway. The room smelled of sweat, ale, and determination. A single candle burned in the center of the table, its flame trembling with every draught from the door. Samuel Adams stood near it, his voice low but steady. "Brothers," he said, "the king taxes our tea, our paper, our freedom. We have written, we have pleaded, we have waited. Now we must answer, not with words, but with action." Around him, the faces were weary but resolute. Some were young, their eyes bright with conviction. Others were older, hardened by years of disappointment. They were not soldiers, at least, not yet. They were fathers and sons who still hoped to live in peace, but had learned that peace could not be bought with silence. Outside, the harbor slept beneath a pale moon. 3 ships floated there, heavy with cargo: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Each held hundreds of chests of tea symbols of a faraway power that had forgotten the faces of the people it ruled. The British crown claimed dominion, but the people of Boston had begun to see themselves differently, not as subjects, but as souls born free. A young man named Nathaniel looked out the tavern window, his hands clenched. "If we do this," he whispered, "there is no going back." Samuel Adams met his gaze. "There never was," he said simply. The decision came not with shouts, but with silence. One by one the men nodded. They would act that night, not to destroy, but to declare, to speak in the only language tyrants understood. Outside, snow began to fall thin and weightless, like the calm before a storm. As the hour neared midnight, they gathered near the docks, cloaked and hooded, their faces streaked with soot. Some wore feathers, disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians, not to deceive, but to remind the world that this land no longer belonged to kings. It belonged to those who would defend it. The ships loomed ahead, dark shapes against the starlit water. The guards offered little resistance. Perhaps they understood, or perhaps they were simply tired of enforcing orders that served men across the ocean. The rebels climbed aboard their boots, thudding softly on the frozen decks. The first chest was lifted, pried open, and dumped into the harbor. The tea hit the water with a dull splash, the leaves spreading like ink across the tide. Then another chest and another. Soon the harbor was filled with the scent of bitter tannin and the murmur of waves carrying away a king's arrogance. The men worked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic thud of wood and the sigh of the sea. They were not vandals, not thieves. They took nothing but their dignity back. From the nearby wharf, a few onlookers watched their faces, half hidden in scarves. One woman whispered, "They'll hang for this." An old fisherman beside her shook his head. "No," he said. "They're giving us something worth dying for." When the last chest sank beneath the icy water, the men stood in stillness. The harbor glittered faintly under the moonlight, a thin sheen of floating tea catching the silver light. It looked almost beautiful, like a painting or perhaps a prayer. Samuel Adams removed his hat, bowed his head, and whispered, "So may tyranny be drowned." Then, without another word, they vanished into the night. By morning, the news spread like wildfire. The British authorities called it treason. The people called it courage. Across the colonies, men and women spoke the word Boston with reverence and fear. In the churches, ministers prayed for mercy. In the streets, children played at rebellion. The tea that stained the harbor had seeped into every heart, steeping a new kind of spirit, one that no empire could contain. The king's response came swift and cruel. The port was closed, soldiers marched through the streets, and punishments were promised. But it was too late. The silence of the oppressed had been broken, and once broken, it could never be restored. In homes lit by candlelight, men read aloud the accounts of what had happened. They spoke of freedom as though it were not a dream, but a birthright. And in each whispered conversation, in each trembling signature on petitions and letters, the seeds of a nation began to take root. The night the tea fell into the sea, the world changed in ways no one could yet see. Empires crumble slowly like cliffs beneath the waves. But that night, the first crack appeared. The tide of history began to shift, not toward kings and crowns, but toward people who believed that truth and courage could build something better. Years later, an old man who had stood on the docks that night would tell his grandson, "We did not throw away T-Boy. We threw away fear." And so Boston, the city beneath the salt mist, became more than a place. It became a symbol, a beginning. The whispers of that cold December evening carried across oceans and centuries, reminding every generation that freedom often starts not with war, but with a single act of quiet defiance. And on that night, as the tide carried the tea out to sea, the world began to dream of liberty, still fragile, still uncertain, but alive at last. The salt-stained dawn rose over Boston Harbor, carrying with it the faint scent of tea and defiance. The sea that once served the empire had turned against it, its waves whispering of rebellion. Word of what had happened on that cold December night spread swiftly, crossing rivers and colonies, like a spark through dry grass. In taverns and farmhouses, and in candle-lit churches, people spoke of the men who had faced a king and chosen conscience over comfort. But courage once awakened demands to grow. The act that began in silence would soon echo across a continent. Winter clung stubbornly to the city, its breath fogging every window pane and freezing the harbor's edge. The tea had settled beneath the water, lost to the tide, yet its meaning lingered like a sermon without end. The British called it vandalism. The colonists called it justice. And somewhere between those two words, a new identity began to take shape, a people who had forgotten how to bow. In the weeks that followed, Boston grew quiet, but it was not the quiet of fear. It was the hush that comes when hearts are gathering strength. The British soldiers patrolled the streets in their red coats, boots striking against cobblestone like a warning drum. They spoke in the clipped tones of authority, but their eyes betrayed unease. They could sense it, that strange new calm in the faces of the townsfolk, the stillness before the storm. At the Green Dragon Tavern, where the rebels often met, Samuel Adams leaned over a rough-hewn table, his hands clasped tightly. The candlelight threw long shadows across his face, making him look older than his years. "They will come for us," said one of the younger men beside him. "They'll close our ports, seize our trade, starve us until we bend." Adams nodded slowly. "Then we must learn to live without what they give us." A murmur of agreement passed through the room. These were not men of wealth or influence. They were carpenters, printers, farmers, but something larger than status had begun to bind them. They no longer spoke as subjects, but as citizens, a word that still tasted strange on their tongues, but filled their chests with fire. Outside, the snow fell in soft, steady sheets, covering the footprints of soldiers and rebels alike. Boston looked peaceful, but under that quiet surface, the city's pulse beat fast. The women kept watch from windows, sewing flags and mending uniforms before there was even an army to wear them. The children wide-eyed whispered stories of the tea men, imagining them as heroes from ancient legends. And the men, weary from long days and longer doubts, prayed for the strength to stand if the king decided to crush them. When spring came, so did the reckoning. Parliament in London answered the Boston Tea Party not with dialogue but with punishment. The port was shut tight. No ship could enter or leave. Merchants went bankrupt, fishermen starved, and families began to ration bread. But even as hunger tightened its grip, so did pride. From distant colonies, New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania wagons arrived, bearing food and supplies. For the first time, the colonies looked to one another, not to the crown. The lines that had once divided them began to blur. A preacher in a small New England church spoke words that echoed through the land. "We were 13 colonies yesterday. Perhaps under God's eye, we shall be one nation tomorrow." That single thought, simple, fragile, moved like wind through the fields and forests of America. Farmers laid down plows to attend town meetings. printers set type for pamphlets that cried for freedom, and in homes lit only by the glow of firelight, mothers whispered to their children, "You will live to see a new world." But for all the talk of liberty, fear still clung to them. They had defied the most powerful empire on earth. The king's ships crowded the harbors, his soldiers drilled on the commons, his law demanded obedience. And yet, when night fell, lanterns burned in secret windows, the signal of unity. The rebellion was no longer a rumor. It was a living thing. One evening, a messenger rode into Boston. His horse lathered his coat torn by the wind. He carried news from the South assemblies in other colonies had joined the cause. In taverns and town squares, people gathered to hear his words read aloud. "We are not alone," he said. "We are one people under one hope." The crowd erupted in cheers that sounded more like prayers. For the first time, the colonists saw themselves not as isolated provinces, but as brothers and sisters bound by the same injustice. Still, the British did not listen. More troops arrived. More laws were passed. The noose tightened around the city. But the harder the empire tried to silence them, the louder the colonists' conviction grew. They no longer argued for small freedoms, but for the soul of man itself. One night, as moonlight shimmered on the frozen harbor, Samuel Adams stood alone on the wharf, where months earlier the tea had been cast away. The wind whipped at his cloak, carrying the faint smell of salt and history. He thought of the men who had stood beside him that night, their courage, their laughter, their fear. And he realized that the act had not been about tea or taxes at all. It had been about the right to say no. That single word, whispered against tyranny, had become a spark that no ocean could drown. And though the fires of war had not yet begun, he could already hear the distant rumble, the march of something inevitable. Elsewhere in the colonies, preachers spoke of freedom from their pulpits. Farmers stored powder in barns, and blacksmiths hammered swords from plowshares. The spirit of resistance moved like breath across the land, unseen but unstoppable. In the quiet of his heart, Adams prayed not for victory but for courage. He knew that freedom once born was a fragile thing. It required sacrifice, patience, and the willingness to lose everything for the sake of one unyielding truth that no man, however crowned, could own another's soul. As dawn broke over Boston, the first rays of sunlight caught the frozen harbor where the tea still slept beneath the waves. The wind carried the faint scent of it inland, into the streets, into the hearts of the people. It was the smell of rebellion and rebirth, sharp and bitter, but alive. From that day forward, every cup poured in America, no matter how humble, was more than tea. It was a remembrance, a quiet toast to those who had stood together in the cold and dared to say no. And somewhere beyond the Atlantic, in palaces of marble and gold, kings still believed they ruled the world. They could not yet see that the world had already changed, that a people who had once bowed their heads had begun to lift them toward the horizon where the first dawn of liberty was waiting. The wind that once carried the scent of tea and rebellion across Boston Harbor had begun to stir the hearts of 13 scattered colonies. What had started as a quiet act of defiance was growing into something vast and unstoppable. The word freedom had crossed lips in whispers. Now it rose in sermons in taverns, and in the songs of men who no longer feared to dream. Yet freedom, like all holy things, demanded its price. And on a December night, when the world seemed frozen still, that price would begin to be paid in courage and unity, and in a sea turned bitter with defiance. Boston lay cloaked in darkness once again, but this night was different. The city did not sleep. Behind shuttered windows, candles burned low, their flames bending with each gust of wind. The harbor shimmered faintly under a rising moon, and 3 British ships, still and silent, stood as symbols of the power that had ruled for generations. Yet that power was trembling. The people of Boston had found a voice, and it was about to speak again. The cold bit deep into the skin, sharper than a knife, but the men gathering near the wharf barely noticed. They moved quietly, their faces hidden beneath paint and feathers, their hearts thudding in rhythm with the restless tide. Among them were sailors and smiths, carpenters and clerks, men of no titles but of conviction. Each carried a memory of the night when tea first touched the sea, and each understood that history would not forget what they were about to do. Samuel Adams stood at the edge of the dock, the lantern light carving his face into planes of shadow and resolve. The wind pressed against his coat, and he could taste the salt on his lips. Let no harm come to man or ship, he reminded them softly. We come not to destroy, but to awaken. His words were steady, but his chest felt tight. He knew the cost of rebellion. He knew that once the tide turned, there would be no turning back. The men nodded their breath, rising in pale clouds. Then, without a signal, they began to move swift and silent as the tide itself. Boots thudded on wooden planks. Ropes creaked. The first man leapt aboard the Dartmouth, followed by another and another, until the deck groaned beneath the weight of their determination. The hold was opened, revealing the king's treasure, hundreds of chests packed with tea, each stamped with the mark of empire. For a moment, no one moved. Then one man lifted a crate, pried it open, and poured its contents into the water. The tea burst forth like dark smoke scattering across the waves. The sound was small, almost tender, a whisper more than a shout. Yet it was the whisper that changed the world. Soon the harbor was alive with motion. Men worked quickly, methodically, heaving chest after chest overboard. The air filled with the scent of tea and salt and sweat. The moon caught the ripples, turning the water into a sheet of silver. The sea itself seemed to shimmer with approval, as though it too had grown tired of tyranny. From the shore, families watched in silence. Mothers clutched their children's hands, unsure whether to feel pride or fear. Old men bowed their heads, whispering prayers that their sons would live to see the dawn. And when the last crate vanished beneath the waves, the harbor was still again, save for the sound of water slapping gently against the ships, and the faint rustle of tea leaves drifting like ashes of an old world. The men left as they had come, quietly, without boasting. Their task was done. Yet none of them could have imagined the echo their actions would create. By morning, the news had spread from Boston to every corner of the colonies. The British would call it treason. The people would call it courage. In the days that followed, anger thundered across the Atlantic. The king's ministers demanded punishment. The port of Boston was closed. Soldiers poured into the city, their muskets gleaming, their orders merciless. Trade stopped. Hunger began. But the spirit that had awakened could not be chained again. The colonies rallied as one. Wagons loaded with food and supplies rolled toward Massachusetts from towns hundreds of miles away. Farmers offered their harvests, blacksmiths their tools, widows their last coins. For the first time, the people of America began to see one another not as strangers divided by province or accent, but as family bound not by geography, but by a single belief that no one should live forever under another's command. Meetings were held in churches and courthouses, in barns and fields. Men spoke of liberty with trembling hands and shining eyes. Women wrote letters that carried news and hope across great distances. Even those who feared war could not deny the pull of it, the sense that a new world was struggling to be born. Yet beneath the hope ran a current of dread. No one knew what the king would do next. His wrath was legendary, his armies vast. The colonists prayed for peace, but they began to sharpen their blades. "We ask for fairness," said one preacher, "but if we must, we will fight for it." That winter was the longest Boston had ever known. Snow fell thick over the silent harbor, covering the ships and the water alike. But even as the city slept under white stillness, the memory of that night, the night the tea fell and the sea spoke of freedom, burned like an ember beneath the ice. Across the colonies that ember caught fire. In taverns, men raised their cups not in tribute to kings, but in remembrance of courage. In farmhouses, fathers taught their children the meaning of that small, powerful word, liberty. And in every quiet prayer, every whispered story told by the hearth, the legend grew. The world would one day remember revolutions by the clash of armies, the roar of cannons, and the signatures of great men. But in Boston, freedom had begun, not with a battle cry, but with the soft splash of tea falling into water and the steady beating of hearts that refused to surrender. As dawn rose once more over the frozen bay, the sea glittered with shards of ice. The tea was long gone, but the bitterness it left behind had turned into strength. The people of Boston of America had found their voice, and from that moment on, the world would never again mistake silence for obedience. For in that night's quiet rebellion, something eternal had awakened the certainty that even the smallest act, when born of faith and courage, can change the course of human history forever. The harbor slept under ice, but the fire that had been lit in the hearts of men refused to fade. The quiet rebellion in Boston had awakened something that could no longer be contained. What began as a whisper of defiance had become a hymn of unity, echoing across valleys and farms, through towns and forests. The British Crown, far across the sea, believed it had silenced the colonies by closing their port. But silence is not always surrender. Beneath that stillness, the tide of a new nation was rising, and when it came, it would sweep the old world away. Morning came softly to Boston. Its light filtered through the pale haze of winter. The harbor, once filled with ships, now lay still, its surface frozen like glass. Beneath the ice, the remnants of tea still drifted in silence, a bitter echo of the night when men had dared to defy an empire. But the people above that frozen water were no longer the same. They walked with a new steadiness, a quiet strength that no decree could break. For months, the British blockade had strangled the city. Trade ceased. Fishermen could no longer cast their nets. The markets were empty and the warehouses echoed with hunger. Yet even as bellies ached and hands trembled, the people did not bow. Theirs was not a rebellion of rage, but of conviction. They prayed together in cold churches, their voices rising like smoke through the rafters, thanking God for the gift of endurance. One morning, Samuel Adams stood at the edge of the harbor, watching the sunlight scatter across the frozen sea. The water seemed to glow faintly, as though remembering the courage it had witnessed. He thought of the men who had lifted those chests months before, how they had risked everything for the idea that dignity mattered more than comfort. He whispered to himself, "Freedom tastes bitter before it becomes sweet." Across the colonies, people spoke of Boston with reverence. Wagons from Pennsylvania and Virginia arrived loaded with grain and salt and blankets. The people of New York sent barrels of flour. From the Carolinas came tobacco and rice. Farmers who had never seen the ocean sent what little they had, signing their names on notes that read, "For our brothers in bondage." It was not charity, it was kinship. For the first time, the 13 colonies looked upon one another and saw not rivals, but reflections. The British, frustrated and proud, saw this unity as rebellion. Orders came from London like thunder: punish the city, crush the spirit, make an example. Red-coated soldiers filled the streets, their muskets gleaming, their eyes cold. They marched past starving families with the arrogance of men certain of victory. But what they could not see was that each act of cruelty only deepened the colonists' resolve. When a British officer confiscated bread from a child one afternoon, the baker who witnessed it said nothing. He only stared. But that night when the soldiers had gone, he lit a lantern in his window, the secret signal that another house stood ready to resist. Within weeks, lanterns burned in every district. Small flames in the darkness scattered stars that formed a single constellation of defiance. In the spring, the ice began to melt. The harbor sighed as it loosened its grip on winter. Children ran to the shore to watch the water move again, the faint scent of tea still rising with the tide. Some said the sea had changed color, that it shimmered like copper in the sun. Others swore that when the wind blew from the east, they could still smell the faint bitterness of rebellion in the air. The elders smiled. "Let it stay," one woman said softly, "so that we never forget." The soldiers grew restless. They mocked the townspeople, called them beggars and fools. But the people answered only with silence, for they understood something the empire did not. That silence can speak louder than anger. They waited and they watched, knowing that somewhere beyond their city, others were preparing to join them. And indeed, in towns across the colonies, men gathered in secret, drafting words that would change the course of history. In Virginia, a farmer named Thomas Jefferson wrote by candlelight, his pen trembling as if guided by something divine. In Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin spoke of unity, of wisdom, of patience. And in the streets of Boston, Samuel Adams whispered to those who passed him in the market, "Courage has already begun, the rest is only teammates." That summer, the port remained closed, but Boston's heart opened wider than ever. Children carried water to those who labored. Wives prayed beside their husbands. Neighbors became brothers. Strangers became family. The hardship that was meant to break them became the bond that sealed them. One evening, as dusk settled over the city, the church bells began to ring. Slowly at first, then all at once. From every steeple, every chapel, every small meeting house, the sound filled the air. No one had ordered it. No one needed to. It was the voice of a people remembering who they were. The soldiers paused in their march, startled by the sound. One young officer, barely 20, turned to his superior and asked, "What are they celebrating?" The older man scowled. "They're reminding us that they still have a soul." As night fell, lanterns glowed in every window again. The sea shimmered under the moonlight, restless and alive. The scent of tea, faint, ghostly, seemed to drift once more through the air, carried by the breeze. The people inhaled deeply, and in that breath was a vow. They would not kneel again. Years later, when the war had come and gone, when victory had been won at great cost, those who survived would tell their children about that season of silence. They would say, "Before freedom was declared, it was endured. Before it was written on paper, it was written on hearts." And even then, in peaceful years, when ships once again filled the harbor and the markets overflowed with goods, the people swore they could still taste something different in the air, a faint trace of bitterness, yes, but also of something richer. Freedom, like the tea that once stained their waters, had left its flavor in everything. So when travelers from distant lands asked the people of Boston what had begun their revolution, they would smile and answer, "It began with a question poured into the sea and an answer carried back on the wind. The water that once bore the empire's ships now carried the first dreams of a nation. And as the tide flowed out toward the open ocean, it whispered to the world that something sacred had been born not in battle, not in conquest, but in the quiet courage of ordinary souls who learned at last how to say no and mean it forever." The waves that once carried tea and rebellion now carried whispers of something far greater. The American colonies were no longer simply defying a king. They were becoming a new voice in the story of humanity, a voice that dared to speak of freedom, dignity, and unity. Yet far from those frozen harbors beyond the reach of cannons or crowns, another story had long been waiting beneath the dust of forgotten ages. Across the ocean, where deserts stretched wide and rivers cut through silence, an ancient city slept its stones, holding the memory of a people who had learned millennia ago that peace could be stronger than war. It was time for the world to remember Corral. In the heart of the Peruvian desert, the wind never truly stops. It hums softly across the dunes, brushing over ancient stones and carrying the faint echo of a civilization that once dreamed under the same sun that warms the world today. To the unknowing traveler, the place appears lifeless, just a stretch of sand and sky, the color of faded parchment. But to those who listen closely, Corral still speaks. It was not a city of kings or conquerors, not a land of swords or shields. Corral was born from the simple rhythm of river and stone, of hands that built not for power, but for harmony. 5,000 years ago, when Egypt was young, And Mesopotamia, still new men and women gathered here to build terraces, temples, and homes that rose gently from the earth like prayers turned to architecture. Their pyramids were not monuments to death, but to life itself. Long before the world discovered iron or bronze, the people of Corral discovered balance. They wove baskets of reeds, crafted flutes from the bones of birds, and played music under the same stars that we now call ancient. Their melodies did not celebrate victory in war. They celebrated harvest, rainfall, birth. Where other civilizations raised walls, Corral raised plazas. Where others sought dominion, Corral sought harmony. The Supe River wound its way nearby a ribbon of silver through the ochre plain. It was their lifeline. From it came water for crops and reeds for weaving, and in its murmuring flow they heard the pulse of the divine. Each season when the river swelled, the people offered songs instead of sacrifices, believing that gratitude was a more powerful offering than fear. When archaeologist Ruth Shady first arrived here in the late 20th century, she found not the grandeur of marble or gold, but the quiet endurance of clay and stone. The desert sun beat upon her shoulders as she brushed away the layers of time.
Every handful of sand revealed another secret, the remains of homes aligned to the stars, fragments of woven cloth that still held the colors of the earth and the faint outlines of a society that had lived without weapons. She paused often to marvel not at what she found, but at what she didn't. No traces of war, no signs of fortresses or soldiers. It was as if the people of Corral had mastered something humanity had forgotten, the art of peace. They had built for creation, not conquest. Their greatness lay not in the walls they raised, but in the harmony they preserved. Under the pale sky, Ruth stood on the summit of the Great Pyramid of Corral and looked across the valley. The wind played with her hair, carrying the scent of dust and memory. She closed her eyes and listened. In that vast stillness, she could almost hear them, the distant sound of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of prayers spoken in a language lost to centuries. For a moment it was as if time folded in on itself and the ancient city breathed again. She imagined the people who once walked these streets, children chasing each other through courtyards of sun-baked clay, mothers weaving baskets by the fire, priests watching the sky for signs of the seasons. Their world was not built on fear, but on trust. Trust in one another, in nature, in the rhythm of things unseen. And when night fell, they did not light torches for war, but fires for song. The world today often believes that progress is measured by power, by technology, by conquest. But Corral whispers a gentler truth, that civilization begins not with the blade, but with the heart. The people of this lost city understood something timeless, that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the practice of compassion. When the excavations finally revealed the full extent of Corral, the plazas, the amphitheaters, the pyramids worn smooth by time, the archaeologists stood in awe. It was not just a discovery, it was a revelation. This was the oldest city in the Americas, a mother to countless cultures that would come after. And yet its legacy was not domination, it was harmony. The wind rose again, sweeping across the ruins, filling the air with a low melodic hum.
Some said it was just the sound of air moving through stone. Others, standing in silence, swore it was the song of chorale itself, the same melody once played on bone flutes beneath a sky untouched by ambition. Ruth Shady took one last look before leaving the site that evening. The sun was setting behind the distant hills, turning the sand to gold and the river to bronze. She felt a deep peace settle over her. History had always been written by conquerors, but here in this forgotten valley, it had been whispered by builders, dreamers, and lovers of life. As the first stars appeared, the wind carried her footsteps away, but the message of chorale remained. In a world that still wrestles with its hunger for power, the ruins stood as a quiet sermon. Humanity does not endure because it conquers, but because it creates, because it remembers, because it chooses to build, even when it has every reason to destroy. Perhaps that is why chorale still breathes in the silence, because the earth itself refuses to forget the place where peace was born. And somewhere across the ocean, in cities of glass and steel, the same sun that once warmed chorale now glows behind our towers. Its light asks the same question the ancients once answered with song: will we build our future as they built theirs? With harmony, with gratitude, with faith that peace, not power, is what truly lasts. As the desert wind dies down and night settles like a soft prayer, the stones of chorale gleam faintly under the stars, unbroken, eternal. The oldest city of the New World still stands, whispering to those who will listen that love, cooperation, and memory are the truest foundations of civilization. The wind that whispered over the ruins of chorale seemed to carry more than dust. It carried memory. It drifted across centuries and oceans, finding its way into the ears of those who could still listen, reminding humankind that there was once a civilization that chose peace instead of conquest, harmony instead of hunger for dominion. The archaeologist had uncovered more than stone walls and relics. She had awakened a truth buried not in the earth, but in the heart of humanity itself. And as the wind moved across the desert, it seemed to hum the same melody that had echoed through chorale's ancient plazas thousands of years ago. A song made not of words, but of faith and joy.
At sunset, the valley of soup turned gold. The light stretched across the land like a gentle hand touching the ancient pyramids of chorale and turning their edges to fire. The air was dry, yet alive with sound, the whisper of sand, the soft calling of distant birds, and somewhere, faintly, the echo of a flute. No one knew exactly where the sound came from. It was as if the earth itself was breathing, sighing out the memory of music that had never truly died. Dr. Ruth Shady paused her work and lifted her head. The archaeologists around her kept digging, brushing, cataloging, each absorbed in their own rhythm, but she stood motionless, eyes half closed, letting the desert's melody find her. It was not just sound, it was story. She imagined the people who had once lived here thousands of years before any empire, before any written word. She could almost see them, men and women, gathering in the plaza as dusk descended, their shadows long and graceful on the packed earth.
They did not gather to trade or to plan wars. They came to celebrate life itself. The air would have shimmered with the scent of cooked maize and roasted fish. The river beyond would murmur like a companion, and then from the steps of the great platform the music would begin. The first notes came from flutes carved of pelican bone, their tones high and thin like the cry of the wind. Then came the drums, their steady beat matching the heartbeat of the people. The music rose and fell in waves, weaving through the air like prayer. Children clapped their hands. Women swayed in rhythm, and elders closed their eyes, their lips moving in silent blessing. It was not just a song, it was a declaration of who they were. Every civilization leaves behind ruins, but chorale left behind harmony. Their instruments, simple yet sacred, were found centuries later buried near the altars. Some still carried traces of pigment red and yellow, like sunlight captured in clay. When researchers gently blew air through them, sound returned fragile and trembling, as though awakening from a dream. Ruth once held one of those flutes in her gloved hands. It was light as a bird's bone, but the weight of time within it was immense. She remembered raising it to her lips, barely daring to breathe. The sound that emerged was faint, yet it cut through the desert air like a whisper from another world. She had felt her eyes sting with tears. It was not sadness she felt, it was connection. Across 5 millennia, she had found herself speaking to those who had once stood in this same light, looking at this same horizon, believing in the same quiet grace of existence. As night deepened, the stars came alive, brilliant against the black sky. In Chorale, the ancients had mapped those constellations long before telescopes or mathematics tracing lines between them to guide their seasons and ceremonies. They believed the stars were messengers of the divine guides, not of destiny, but of rhythm. For them, heaven and earth were not separate. The pulse of the river mirrored the movement of the Milky Way. The music of the flutes was an echo of creation itself. Ruth wrote by lantern light that evening, her journal pages trembling in the warm breeze. They built no army, she wrote, but they built beauty. They left no swords, only songs. Perhaps that is why they vanished, not from weakness, but from completion. They gave the world a lesson it was not yet ready to understand. The following morning, the wind rose early, sweeping through the valley, with a voice that almost sounded human. The workers paused, shielding their eyes from the sand. For a moment it seemed as though the entire landscape were moving the dunes, breathing the pyramids, shimmering the air, vibrating with unseen energy. Ruth smiled softly. "They are still here," she murmured. The people of Carol never truly left, and perhaps she was right. For even in the modern world, where noise often drowns out silence, the message of chorale endures. In every song sung for peace, in every act of kindness that bridges division, in every child who learns to build instead of destroy their spirit, breathes again. They remind us that civilization is not measured by the size of our cities, but by the depth of our compassion. When the sun set again, Ruth climbed once more to the top of the Great Pyramid. She looked out at the valley spread before her, washed in crimson and shadow. The Supe River glimmered like a vein of light. Somewhere far below, one of her students played softly on a replica flute. The melody rose through the air, haunting, delicate, eternal. It mingled with the wind and drifted into the distance where it seemed to blend with the song of the earth itself. For a long time, Ruth stood there listening. She imagined that the spirits of chorale were listening too, smiling from the edge of time. She thought of all the centuries of silence that had passed, of how long the world had waited to hear this music again. And as the sound faded, replaced by the heartbeat hush of the desert, she whispered, "You were right. Peace was never weakness. It was wisdom." The wind answered her with a sigh that seemed almost like gratitude. Far below, the campfires flickered small and golden, like the same fires that had once burned in ancient hearths. The stars above pulsed brighter, mirrored in the flames, and between them the infinite sky and the tiny lights of men. The melody of chorale continued a bridge of sound between the living and the lost. Perhaps one day, when the noise of our own age grows too heavy, humanity will return to listen again to the flutes of the desert, to the music that once held the world in balance, to the city that sang not of conquest, but of communion. And when that day comes, the wind of chorale will rise once more, carrying its song over the mountains, across the seas, and into the hearts of those who remember that true civilization is not built upon victory, but upon the gentle, enduring art of peace. The wind that once carried the sound of bone flutes across the valley of Chorale drifted onward far beyond the deserts of Peru. It crossed oceans and mountains, threading through time itself. Wherever it went, it whispered the same lesson, that civilizations rise not by power, but by peace. It touched forgotten temples, empty cathedrals, ruined towers, and even the great cities of our age. Some heard it and turned away, preferring noise to silence. But others paused and listened faintly, remembering a truth older than language, that harmony once lost can still be found again. Morning light spread slowly across the Andes, painting the peaks in hues of rose and amber. The valley below stirred with life wind brushing the grass, a river murmuring through its stony bed, and the faint hum of the world awakening. To most it was an ordinary dawn, but to those who walked among the ruins of Chorale, it felt like the breathing of something eternal. Dr. Ruth Shady rose early as she did each day, stepping into the cool air with her notebook in hand. Around her, the team was still asleep. The fire from the night before had burned down to soft embers. She walked past it quietly and climbed the slope toward the highest platform. Every morning she climbed this way, not for discovery, but for conversation with the earth, with history, with the memory of those who had come before. The air was dry but fragrant with the scent of sand and time. Below her, the river shimmered faintly, winding through the valley like a silver ribbon. The pyramids of Chorale lay silent, their outlines glowing in the rising sun. They had endured 5,000 years of wind and silence. They had seen empires rise and fall, oceans shift, languages vanish. And still they stood unbroken, patient, and kind. Ruth sat on the highest stone and closed her eyes. The wind touched her face gently like a hand. She thought of the people who once called this place home, the artisans who shaped clay, the farmers who sang to their fields, the mothers who hummed lullabies as their children fell asleep under the same sky that now arched above her. They were gone, but not lost. Something of their spirit lingered here, carried in the air, woven into the light. Perhaps she thought this was why Chorale had survived so long, not through force, but through gentleness. The desert had tried to bury it, yet the earth itself seemed unwilling to forget a civilization built on peace. You built with love, she murmured aloud, and the world remembers. Far in the distance, a condor traced slow circles in the morning sky. Its shadow passed across the sand, vast and silent. For a moment, Ruth imagined it as a messenger between worlds, the living and the lost, the present and the past. She took a deep breath, feeling the rhythm of the valley around her. The wind was steady, the river eternal, the stones warm beneath her palms. The land felt alive as though it were listening too. She opened her notebook and began to write, her pen moving softly. Corral is not merely an archaeological site. It is a message. It tells us that peace is possible, that creation can outlast destruction, and that harmony leaves deeper roots than fear. She paused, then smiled faintly. Maybe, she whispered, this is the proof humanity has been searching for, that goodness too can endure. As the day unfolded, the workers began to stir. They moved quietly, respectful of the stillness. One of them carried a small speaker and began to play a recording. A reconstruction of the flutes and drums once played in Carol, recreated from the instruments they had unearthed. The sound rose slowly into the air, trembling and pure. It was the same melody Ruth had once heard in her dreams, the same tune the wind seemed to hum on sleepless nights. The notes drifted over the valley, carrying with them something ancient and tender. For a moment, time seemed to fold. The workers looked up from their tasks. The music spread through the camp, blending with the rustle of the river and the hum of bees in the grass. The desert was no longer silent, it was singing again. Children from a nearby village came running, their laughter bright and clear. They danced barefoot around the ruins, their small hands raised as though greeting the sky. Ruth watched them and felt tears gather in her eyes. In their laughter, she heard the same joy that must once have filled these plazas thousands of years ago. It was as if Corral was alive again, breathing through them, remembering through them. When evening came, the valley turned gold once more. The pyramids glowed softly in the fading light, their shadows stretching long and deep. The team gathered to share their final meal of the day. Someone lit a lantern, another began to hum, and soon one by one voices joined in. They sang without words, a simple human melody. Even the wind seemed to pause and listen. Later, when darkness settled fully, Ruth walked once more to the pyramid's summit. The stars burned bright above, countless and close. She could see the Milky Way spilling across the heavens, the same celestial river her ancestors must have traced. She knelt there, overwhelmed by a sense of belonging, not to any nation or era, but to the earth itself. She whispered a prayer not for discovery, but for remembrance.
May we learn what they knew,
She said softly. May we build as they built, not for power but for harmony. May we remember that the world does not need more kings, it needs more keepers. The wind answered her once again, gentle and infinite. It carried her words into the night, over the dunes, across the mountains, out toward the sea. And somewhere, perhaps that same wind brushed the face of another archaeologist in another time, or touched the hair of a child sleeping in a city far away, reminding humanity of something we too easily forget, that we belong not to the past we build, but to the peace we leave behind. The valley of Corral slept beneath the stars.
The music of the ancient flutes had faded into memory, but its echo lingered in every heart that had heard it. The earth was breathing again, slow, steady, alive. And as the wind sighed across the ruins, it carried one last message as clear as the dawn.